Mhm. All right. So this talk is gonna be on open banking, or whatever that is, and it's also gonna be a bit a journey of what I've been doing for the past approximately 4 years. So this will, of course, be a little bit about the company that I'm with, but also some of the stuff that we've been doing in the open banking world. Should, of course, not be necessarily seen as sort of an advertisement talk, but please see it and question it with everything that you think is relevant for this. Over the past long time, I've been working on one of the last bastions of open data that is back in the world. Like one of the places where financial data is, data is generally hidden away and interoperability is really poor, has been traditionally within the banking sector. And the sad fact is that open banking is extremely closed. Even though some of the new initiatives that have been on the market here is still an extremely high bar to entry into the financial sector. A lot of this has to do with regulation. A lot of this has to do with traditional defensive strategies that banks always have had to like wall in their world. The reason why I got into financial data is a company that I worked with maybe 4, 5, 6 years ago, where I started working with this company from Aarhus called Spear. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but we do some financial planning, especially try to help young people understand their financial situation. In order to build this product, we had to have some technology that I'm going to go into in a moment. After this, we kind of split into two things. So when I'm talking about Nordic API Gateway, everything is our technology to connect to banks, to get information from banks, to do payments on banks, whereas everything that is related to Spear is about the consumer-facing, the product that's trying to be friendly to the consumer, trying to help them understand the digital economy, where it's in the old days you would pile away a budget that would be like having some jar in the kitchen where you put like 200 kroner in every week, and that was like your budget, right? And you would pick out money from it during the week when you do grocery shopping. But today it's a digital economy. You have multiple cards, you have transactions that have been drawn at different times. It's really, really hard to get an overview of it, and you get offered a lot of external payment products. Like suddenly you have the possibility of having multiple banks, you have the possibility of credit cards and other things where it's extremely complicated to get an overview of your financial situation. All of that stuff does not really have to do with trying to get the data from the banks, but also it's an exercise trying to help people. But a little bit of a history lesson. Spear started out as Google Analytics mentality to your economy. So we tried to make a product that was, let me just get an overview of what's going on in my finances. Does not have to be up to date every day, but it needs to be like, I need some general trends here. I need to understand whether in 2 months I will have a problem paying back my loans, for instance. And what happened was, you can almost see it here. This is the view of our solution, where you can kind of have an idea of your economy, but in a very Google Analytics style. We've since moved away from this, but this was like the initial take on trying to understand your finances. Such a financial overview was not available within banks at that time. Once we started this trend, the banks were kind of saying, so ein Ding muss ich auch haben. And then they kind of copied this sort of Google Analytics approach to their economy. So I'm not saying it's still valid for some people to have an overview this way, but what we think today is it's probably going to be much more up to date and much more relevant in sort of the day-to-day situation, rather than something that you look on every 3 months, essentially, because you make bad decisions every day, or you might need guidance every day. But something was problematic for this solution. Like, it was really, really a burning platform, and the major problem here is that for this to work, you had to get data. We had to get some sort of data into the engine so we could do some categorization of your expenses, so we could figure out where it's going, like, are you in a positive trend, a negative trend, and where are you funneling all your money to? And downloading CSV and uploading CSV is like, it's a user journey that is really hard. But how do you do that on a phone, right? It's really, really hard to do that on a phone. Therefore, it was a hard thing to do this in a way where you could do it on an everyday basis. So what we figured out, that since all the banks were launching mobile apps as well, can we just use the same APIs that they use in their mobile app? So we started doing sort of an approach where we said, okay, the banks will not allow us to do this. We engaged in banks, talks with banks, trying to get data out of the banks, trying to get like API access, but nobody was really talking to us. So there was another thing, which was that we were essentially trying to make interoperability, right? We tried to make a piece of software that would work with your bank, rather than only data being residing within the bank. And within the European Union and the copyright directive, there's actually precedents of where you can do reverse engineering based on interoperability. So what we did was we were presenting another view. So think of it as OpenOffice compared to Microsoft Office. You're allowed to reverse engineer the Microsoft Office in order to make a viewer for the data. And so we applied the same principles. And then we moved into a regime where we started doing reverse engineering for this. So a bit about terminology here. So the legal basis for doing all of this is that we can do it because of interoperability under the copyright directive. Otherwise, it's kind of frowned upon, or even illegal, to reverse engineer other people's solutions. But if you have a specific purpose that is okay within the copyright directive or national legislation, then it should be okay. We considered doing other things, even though I think that if you're just doing like HTML screen scraping, or you're reverse engineering an app, you're not doing anything distinctly different between the two things. It's still like trying to access, like you're going behind the view, looking at the network traffic, decoding the network traffic. Therefore, we moved towards sort of API-based scraping or app-based scraping, where we reverse engineer the app and check out the APIs from there, rather than doing it on the sort of screen scraping solution. And the reason is that screen scraping is fairly fragile. If they make a change to the HTML web page, it's going to break fairly soon. Whereas an app, it sort of have this app update life cycle. They have to push out a new update if they want to change things, and that gives us a chance to do this actually in an operational manner. Another good thing about doing APIs is that we limit the data that we access. And we don't want to scrape stuff. Like, we don't want to scrape the name of your advisor in your bank, even though that comes up on every web page that you browse to, even that you just try to get or fetch transactions. When we go by API, we can kind of narrow our scope to ensure that we only fetch the data that we need. And this is actually fairly important for us. We don't want to access data that we don't need, because it's just an accident waiting to happen, right? So one of the things we focused on was trying to do these app-based reverse engineerings, and we saw that Sweden was doing this fairly well as well. So this is a product called BankDroid. It was an open source project in Sweden, where they were probably at the same time we were doing the same thing in Sweden, where they had an open source repository where you could like make plugins for your banks. And then, compared to Sweden and Denmark, Sweden is much more focused on having multiple banks and multiple cards. There's a lot of loyalty schemes tied to credit cards, for instance. So it's the problem of having multiple banks in Sweden is a much bigger problem than it was in Denmark at the point. So they were really aggregating accounts from many different sources into one view, so you had an overview of your financials. So we're kind of looking to the same methodology here. So most of this stuff back in 2013, that was basically, just putting midden proxy on the apps. So that was, we didn't really have to reverse engineer the application itself. We would just like sniff the network traffic. Maybe, at that point it was basically sniff the network traffic because all the TLS stuff was not really hardened at that point. So that was very easy. And then the situation was a bit like this, we went from, we had an app, we had somebody who could log into the app. It could be me, for instance. I think 15 banks or something like that I can log into because I opened an account with them. So you can log into a bank, and then we scrape the network traffic. We implemented this in some code, we ran it in production, and you can fetch data just based and automated and live data all the time. That was really important because then you actually started being able to navigate for sort of all this analytics that got put onto your view. So what the banks did was they were doing like, oh shit, somebody is in our apps, they're in our datas. How do we stop them from there, right? So what they did is they waved their magic wand over the app. They bought solutions from various companies, or they tried to do it in-house, where they either did like, childish stuff, like, not childish stuff, low-level stuff like trying to just do same things like certificate pinning, but of course that can be bypassed if you know where that is. And then you were moving up into sort of app hardening, and there's a lot of vendors out there that will sell you a lot of solutions, but all of them can, given enough time and a dedicated team, be managed. So we applied a bit of cyber to it, and then we successfully, time after time, made it through all these obstacles that were put in place. And this was a life cycle. Sometimes it could happen every week. Essentially, they would put out a release on Tuesdays. We would download the updates, have a patch ready by the time they turned on the feature flag in production. So it could be we had downtimes of maybe 2 minutes or 10 minutes when we detected they turned on the new functionality, then we turned on the feature flag on our end. So this was kind of a bit like a cat and mouse game, right? So how do you reverse engineer for production? I guess it's a bit different than, or a little like large-scale malware analysis, actually. So first of all, you need to have some awesome colleagues, and I'm very fortunate to work with some really bright minds when it comes to reverse engineering. That helps a lot because the more you are, the better you are at like collaborating and talking about the problems and figuring out how to handle them. And then you need to find some tools that work for you. And for us, it's a combination of static and dynamic analysis. So a lot of the stuff can be done on a static level, but we also run some dynamic analysis tools. And I would just like give a great shout out to Frida, which is an awesome tool, especially in the mobile domain. Then we're working in a way where we do automatic, in malware it would be automatic sample fetching, but we have like a bot that downloads stuff from the App Store, keeps us updated about new releases to make sure that we're on top of that. We do some automatic decompiling and initial analysis, so we don't have to look into every sample ourselves just to see what changed. And we have some assessments of whether we need to reverse anything if things change. And then, of course, we develop some in-house tools, which we cannot release because if we release them, the vendors will then use them against us. So it's right now we have some proprietary tools where we can circumvent most of the fingerprinting and most of the security frameworks out there. Using this methodology, we are at probably like 50 APIs that we integrate to. This is more than 300 banks or 500 flavors of banks, so that includes like a corporate channel and a business, a private channel, for instance. So a little bit of the shenanigans that we go through. sometimes you can unmask things when you look at it, and sometimes these things are not very cleverly hidden. Good example is this, that you have a file called icon PNG, but when you look closer at that icon PNG, it's kind of in the wrong place and stuff like that. So you look a little bit in the code further, and if you just XOR it with something, it's actually a public key. So there's a lot of things that are just very simple obfuscation that somebody tried to be clever about. So that's one end of it, and then there's the full professional obfuscation tools. This one is a little more, you laugh a little bit when you find it, because it took 5 minutes to figure it out, but it probably took a banking team, I don't know, multiple cycles just to develop it. So it's also the adversarial effect here is that we are much faster, and we move much faster than they have to put up stuff like this to keep us out. Another realization you do is that everything is just mainframes, man. It's banking and it's mainframes, and everything you see is mainframes. So here's an example from one API in Sweden. You kind of get reports from all the mainframes and all the IBM products that came through, where you just appended to the JSON object, sent out directly to the client, and just scrape it. And in the bottom there's this desperate cry for help, where it's says, if you want to work with us, call us, put into some field. Because they know somebody's looking into this traffic. But it's that part has been always interesting to kind of you get almost a feeling of how the organization works on the inside, like how well structured internal APIs are compared to our public APIs. It's always a bit of almost a sociology study. Anyways, by 2014 we had access to all the Danish major banks. So Denmark, you might be aware, has a bunch of banks. We have 80-something banks in Denmark, but all of them are governed either by their own infrastructure, that would be Nordea and Danske Bank, and the rest are running on what's called banking centrals. We have 3 of those in Denmark. One is called Bankdata, one is called SDC, and one is called BEC. And all of these were kind of what you needed to cover this country. And it was pretty much like a cat and mouse game, and it's been going on. It was going on from 13 until 18, I would say, where we had to, we were doing this sort of lockstep every time they made a change, we made a change, and keeping under the radar at the same time and trying to avoid it. And in the end, we just felt that people were giving up. They stopped pushing more updates, trying to hold us out of this world. So that was pretty funny. Then the European Union suddenly stepped in. This was in 2015. There was a new update to what's called the Payment Services Directive version 2, where they said, basically, if you stop reversing, banks will give you APIs. Or if you don't, then you can continue to do it. But there will be some smaller things. So this was basically the premise we got. PS2 is a great piece of legislation in many kinds. There's a lot of you cannot charge extras if you use a specific credit card. There's a lot of open competition between different banks and different card issuers and stuff like that. So there's a lot of competition being baked into this. But here we were made a promise that the banks would give us APIs if we stopped reversing. And pretty much what happened is yeah, great, now we can actually build a business a little bit more robustly. It can also mean that we can start catering to some customers which are a bit uncertain about the situation, that we don't have an agreement with anybody and we just reverse our way in. That could be, for instance, if you have an accounting system that needs access to bank accounts. That is fairly dominant within the sector, that if you're trying to do accounting, a lot of the stuff in Denmark is still gone by CSV uploads and downloads, and you have people whose entire job is to download CSV and upload CSV. And I think that it's a shame to use resources this way. It's mind-numbing work sometimes, right? So better to use this energy for something where we actually we can use the energy a little better. So the problem is that was a cost to this, and that means that we have to become regulated. And becoming regulated under the Danish financial system, that's pretty heavy. So it is documentation like we never seen it before. So suddenly it was kind of like this bargain where we could probably get some nicer ways, and it was a little bit easier to do explain what we did as a business. But on the other side, it would be like, yeah, you have to file this 50-page report every year, and you have to go through some things that were not extremely relevant to the business operation that we had. But anyways, because we are under this umbrella of financial institutions, then suddenly it covers you as well. But it allows us to flesh out the part of technology that was in Spear as a separate business entity, which I was helping co-founding. That also meant that we moved from little Denmark into Norway, Sweden, and Finland based on reverse engineering, because at that time the APIs were not really ready yet. And then in 2018, PSD2 went into effect. That was like, we were really looking forward to this part. But the problem was that when the banks were supposed to deliver the APIs, it was kind of looking at, nothing. It was just a desert. Like, all the APIs were not ready, all the APIs were not tested. And I can tell you that this was the view in 2018, and sometimes it's even the view today. And it's just mildly frustrating that we still are in a situation where there was this great promise that we should stop reverse engineering, and that would give us an access under regulation that we could actually do the things that the customers really want. Like, the customers really want to have access to this data. And that's because we are like Google and just want to harvest data. Like, we're just facilitating access to things that people really want, right? So it's a little bit better now, but it was really bad. And some of the things that we saw was kind of like horrible. Like, we had to do things that were extremely over-engineered in terms of access to these things. So we had to provide signed software statements signed by multiple certificates by multiple authors. But these software statements, for instance, which kind of define your application and stuff, was not really defined how we should define it. So we had to kind of guess. So every time we submitted a software statement, we would get an error back telling us which key of the JSON we forgot to fill out. So it was kind of like trying to fill out something, and then, you're missing a logo URI. Okay, next one. You're missing your name of your client. Okay, and then the next one. Nothing was documented, right? So we had to go like this. And then we went through this procedure, and then we continued until we hit the end, which was HTTP status 304 undefined, which kind of just said, like, what the are we doing here? And this has been like the journey for us. Like, another example, this is like, and this is like quoting from public documentation. You need to send the digest in JSON and make the digest of the complete JSON string XVV in coding meaning JSON. It was just like complete gibberish, what we ended up seeing. And this is sort of the solution today is like, there's somehow this is like a compliance exercise for the banks. Like, they were forced to make all these APIs, but they were not really able to deliver them as products. So what it is that there's a huge hesitance, at least with some banks, to provide APIs, and by that hesitance, it kind of shines through the product, which means that it's almost impossible to use. Now I'm bashing banks a lot, but some banks are actually pretty good with it, but like the majority of stuff out there is pretty saddening. There's stuff like this, this is what they expect the consumer to use. So this is an authentication method in Sweden called BankID, and they expect users to, choose something on the list there, where it's not even a link, but it's like a unclick something that was made blue. And then some pop-up jumps up, and then you are supposed to authenticate the QR code on your mobile device. Like, you have to have multiple mirrors in order to do that. So there are things that were not really working at all in a mobile domain. And that includes like error messages that, you don't even know what it means, where it's just like complete, like some internal error message that was just put in the face of the end user. So we've seen it from time to time again. And then I think that the one that was kind of breaking our neck was production changes constantly. We were getting fairly used to changes with sort of this mobile app update cycle where they had to push a new client every time in order to make sure that they had some lead time, so not to deprecate the API immediately after. Therefore, we could follow along. We actually got almost like a change notification. They pushed a new update, right? But here, things are just changing in production. They forgot to tell us, and this has also been a challenging time. So I would say that the landscape of open banking right now is completely a mess. I think we're getting a handle on it right now, because we come from a strong reverse engineering culture. We kind of get that we need to look deeper beyond documentation and understand more things than are being said overtly, and therefore it's a little easier for us, at least, to move in this field. But we see larger institutions that are trying to move into this field. They're completely blown back by the level of maturity in this world. And in the end, I think the realization is that we're still running on really ancient technology. Even though you can have these flashy banks and beautiful banks and stuff like that, a lot of the banks are still running on a core platform that is ancient. Some of the examples that are brought up here are, many of the institutions, at least in Denmark, are still running on mainframes. Some have transitions away from mainframes, but it's not because mainframes per se is a bad thing, but it just indicates that sort of their movement speed and their applications, they're fairly old, and it's harder for them to move out of this sort of old way of doing it. But I would say that there's light at the end of the tunnel. I think that probably this year and the next year is the years where we'll see everything starting to work for real. On September 14th last year was the date when everything needed to be in production and production ready. And we're still seeing things that are not in production. And that is by law. So banks are now almost a year delayed. They were actually supposed to be in production the 13th of June. So it's more than a year now since they were supposed to be in production. But we're seeing the regulators also starting actually to help us, which is very nice. But I think it's been a journey where every party of this, it's completely new. Banks are not really interested in this, or were not. But now they're also starting to see that they actually can, if they provide a really, really poor experience towards the end users, we're seeing customers leave banks for that purpose specifically. So it could be in the end that if you, as a bank, or if you as a large corporation, do not offer the possibility of working with your own data, or if you're not working with your financial data of your company and have an easy way to pull it in and out, then you probably end up in a situation where this will be a competition point at some point. Because the immediate effects of this are so, it's so easy to see it when you're a business owner, for instance, that you don't have to upload and download CSVs. It's just a pain, right? So I'm a little bit short, done on time now, so I'm sorry about a very short talk here. But I don't know if anybody have some questions to me, and I'd love to answer them. Also very technical stuff. Yeah.
How badly can these banks be fined if they don't compile some viewpoint?
So the question was, how badly can the banks be fined? So right now, I think it's more of a carrot than stick at the moment. So the banks have to maintain an interface that we can connect to, some sort of endpoints that we can connect to. And what the regulators, at least as we understand it, have the possibility to do is that they can make them do more documentation on their internal stuff, so we can continue to use it in a safe manner. And that is probably where they will consider whether they want to push the other things to production rather than us getting too many insights to it. And in the end, they can get fines if they don't provide what we need, essentially. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you found any security vulnerabilities that you have reported while reversing your banking applications?
So the question was whether we found any security vulnerabilities, and I would say that apps provided, for instance, from banks are very, very, very well screened. My impression is that there's a lot of time invested with external auditors trying to see this. So I think that generally, the attack surface is very limited, first of all. And sort of the malicious stuff that we can do is almost non-existent because everything is so hardened that they don't trust the clients essentially. So the clients, because you can run on root devices, you know that it's a hostile environment, you're running code in something you don't control. Generally, everything there is nothing business critical is going on the devices per se, unless there's like a hardware security element where you can store a key and stuff like that. So attacks that we see, like the threat model that we are to these apps are different than the threat model of a malicious attacker. So because like we have the full flow, like we have the user present, we can log in, we can do all the things. It's a different threat model, right? The other thing is like, if you have somebody like download a malicious app from the App Store, how would that affect it? And generally we don't see any security vulnerabilities, but we see insecure practices, for instance, of implementing cryptography, but those instances are solely or like exclusively for obfuscation purposes. Like it does not serve a security purpose, but it's mostly used to throw us off trying to reverse engineer the APIs. And there we are seeing things that where cryptographers would probably cry. And that includes like simple things like reuse of IVs and stuff like that. Yeah. Yeah.
When do you think that we will get to have APIs for personal use in Denmark?
The question was whether we will have like a personal API, and I think there will be, due to the way that it suddenly got regulated, I think it will be even harder. Like I have some puzzles in my head that at least some of the private stuff should be regulated under data portability of the GDPR, where some of the things that we do on a personal level should be exposed that way, or could be exposed that way, where the banks would not have any liability for having to check licenses and stuff of the ones that expose the data. But as for like just getting an API to your bank, I'm not sure. I've seen banks in Norway doing this, where they did it, where they had a developer portal and you could access your own personal data through the API.
That has been commonplace in Germany. So if
Yeah.
it came to Europe, you might be able to also have German banks.
So you said that it was a common thing in Germany. I think that some markets are more mature to this. I think that the Swedish markets, for instance, they are like completely accepting reverse engineering, for instance, where the Danish market is adverse to it and the Norwegian market is completely screaming when you mention it. So there's also, you clearly see the differences in the local mentality of the different markets, and it's very clear that the union is very segregated on borders. That mentality does not travel across borders. But we do see some banks, I think that especially in sort of new banking era that we're seeing, where there's some challenges coming in. I would expect one of them at some point to launch some sort of connectivity. But I think that the regulation that has been put in place now means that it actually have become harder. And I would actually personally resort to reverse engineering in order to get access to my personal bank account. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned earlier in your talk about Sphere that the Swedish market, they had an open source approach and a lot of because the market of the consumer market of consumers having lots of credit cards, while this was not the case in Denmark back then. Can you elaborate on whether we see similar usage in Denmark?
Yeah. So the question was, in Denmark we see a very like single source bank approach, and in other markets we see multi banks or credit cards. And whether we see a rising trend in Denmark on this would probably true. Yeah, we see some challenges coming in, but it's still a fairly low percentage of the users that will attach more than one bank account to Sphere. It's not necessarily like it's small double digits, I would say, that would try to do it at least. But what have happened also is that we have added other sources as well that will complement your data. So that could play into this. One of the things we added is Reisekortet, for instance, which is just like your travel card that you can attach into your financial. So what happens on the travel card is that you put money onto the travel card, which is kind of like a credit card. Like you put some, it works like a debit card. You put some money on it, and you deduct money from the account when you travel. It's impossible to use if you're trying to figure out whether you want to price compare different products, because all you see is like every once in a while you'd like top up your account with a fixed amount, and you kind of don't get an idea where you travel to and from, because that would be like individual line data. So what we added was we added the travel card as a bank in our solution, and we detect the transfer from your account when you top up the account, and that just vanishes, and then you just see individual travels as expenses instead. Yeah. Peter?
Follow-up question in terms of the interface. You mentioned something about transitioning or moving away from this sort of Google analytics approach to provide a better, I guess, to provide a better user experience for the end users here. Can you elaborate on what other tactics and whether they will apply, because it's more like a single source banking situation in Denmark where people only have one account set up?
Yeah. So the question is, why did we move away from the analytics approach to a more like personal and day-to-day approach, which is what we did essentially. That is how I interpret your question. Sorry about that. And then the thing is that what we saw was that there's nobody looks at analytics data every 3 months. It's not something that you naturally look at on an app. Maybe if you have to do your budgets, yeah. But then 3 months have passed and you are already steered out of course. Like you need to be able to navigate. It's like inertial navigating in a submarine, right? If you come up and get a bearing every 3 months, you might be wildly off course in 3 months, and then that is a demotivator, right? But if you get small navigation hints every day, like from expenses, that you follow your expenses, you're following your budgets, you're following it on a sort of daily basis, and you actually have a relationship. I actually went to the bar yesterday, and I probably bought the other guys or girls too many drinks, right? I was too kind there. It might be that the next time you go to the bar, then you think, it's probably their turn now. And then you have a chance to adjust your economy from that. But if you get that sort of updated report, like, hit in the head after 3 months, then, you just give up, right? So this is a like trying to help people sort of in a behavioral sense, right? Trying to make sure that they have the opportunity to be informed about the economy in a way where they can actually act upon it, but without being like judgmental or anything like that, but just trying to give you hints of where your economy is going. I don't know if that was probably not answering your question. Okay. All right. I can just as closing remark. We're moving into payments now, so it's a bit different game now. So now we're starting to do account-to-account based payments as well on these APIs, and this is of tremendous use, for instance, for a festival like this, right, where you don't want the extra overhead of paying a tax to somebody, like to a card merchant or some middleman, where you can actually get money directly into your account. So it's something that we're working on directly at the moment, trying to, at least in the places where it means a lot, where the margins mean a lot, to provide direct bank payments rather than going by cards. Yeah, Peter? No, yeah, it's kind of like mobile pay, but it's like, just imagine, like we're doing what's called payment initiation and sort of the framework. We kind of fill in the form inside your web-based bank or your mobile bank, and then you do the signing with MID or with your signing credentials. So it's like we just initiate the payment on your behalf. So, but you approve it. So it's just like filling in, like going to BornHack website and clicking a button to transfer money to BornHack for the ticket, for instance. That will just be deducted directly from your account into BornHack's account, not going through a middleman or like a payment gateway or anything like that, just like a direct transfer, as you would have done yourself. But instead of having to fill in the numbers and copy pasting and all that stuff, you just swipe in MID. We can talk about that. We're live with it. Like we're running it live in Finland, for instance. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Well, what about the cross-border transfers? Because there you don't really have any knowledge which route.
Yeah. So when we do payment initiation within the PSD2 framework, which is like the golden thing that was promised to us from the European Union, right? We do whatever is possible. Sorry, we do whatever is possible for from the consumer's perspective. So that means that we're just filling out forms that you can do in your mobile bank or in your web-based bank. So the bank still figures out everything that has to do with bank, like payment handling and all that stuff. It's just a little bit like downloading CSVs, right? The banks still have the data. They still do all the stuff with the data. We just automate that part so you don't have to click, download, upload, essentially. We just do like enter your password and PIN code, and then we have like a robot doing it for you. It's pretty much the same thing we do with payment initiation. That is like we make the payment on your behalf, and then the bank does the execution of it. And that means that when you move into cross-border, it might actually be better to use some different tactics with this. It could be like some of the new challenges that are coming into this domain where they're settling not directly from the bank, but through a third party that has money in one country that needs to exchange it with like the reverse transfer. And then you do local transfers instead. There's many other ways of doing it than just like a bank transfer. And that could be a way to solve the cross-border challenge, because today cross-border, at least from a Danish account, is very expensive. If you move into the Eurozone, like SEPA transfers are the default. So that is different. But for Danish users, it's different. Yeah. Peter? Yeah. So you should see that almost like in a developer terms, like read-write access, right? So we have like kind of read access that is called the Account Information Service License. That is the lowest one. That is the easiest one to get. You still have like professional liability insurance, and you still become a financial institution, stuff like that. What happens, and then if you go to the next license, which is the right one, which is called the Payment Initiation License. Payment initiation is defined by the way that we don't hold money for anybody, we just execute orders. Then you're moving into what's called the payment institutions, which is a higher regulated entity, and you have to have higher insurances and higher compliance requirements. So it is like, read access is less than write, essentially, but makes sense, yeah. And then we will mostly, we don't expect that many to get these licenses, but there will be some operators like payment gateways or us that will have these licenses. Will not be like a web shop does not need to have it, essentially. Peter.
It seems like there is some great possibilities around that sort of, we have in Denmark, we have the mobile pay app, which is sort of there was some other solutions provided by Bank and a bunch of other banks, but like now it's only mobile pay.
Yeah.
And so they have a full monopoly, or almost near monopoly on that. Wouldn't that be hampering to this operation to have multiple actors that are able to use PSD2 payment initiation?
So what mobile pay's model is a little bit different, does not work under the payment initiation scheme right now, as I understand it at least. So they are not like a payment initiation service. They have a different license that is greater than ours, I would say, probably, where they can do other things as well. So they operate on different levels, and they have individual agreements with the banks on how to transfer stuff, and then they fall back on cards as well. So they also have some card-based payments. So there's like, they kind of have a hybrid solution between many different points. But at one point, some things like requirements to do strong customer authentication, like doing NemID approval of transfers and stuff like that, might happen to hit NemID as well at some point. When that completely is rolled out in Denmark, it was like delayed for 18 months at some point because web shops did not implement it. But at that point, everything will be equalized. Like you have to use NemID to make a payment, or you have to use your bank's mobile app to approve the payment with, or something like that. You have to have something that is a multi-factor authentication device that will approve the payment, that fulfills a requirement of knowing that the user was present. So I think at some point we will probably see an equalization across different channels when the payment is executed from the person. It's a different thing when you do like the taking service and other things where it's like executed from the merchant side instead. But like what's called PSU, user-oriented payments, at some point will have to rely on the same level of FCA requirements, which would be like authentication needs to be the same across the board. So I don't know what the future of mobile pay will bring on this, but I think that hopefully this will equalize a little bit our business dealings with this. And then the way that we do it, the risk is extremely low because like you are actually asking us just to fill out a form on your webpage, right? So we can also go with a fairly low margin on each payment because the risk is fairly low for us. And I think that is the pure advantage of these APIs, is that because you're relying on an existing infrastructure, payment infrastructure that is extremely cheap to run, then that should be also reflected throughout the chain and also to the consumer in the end. That was, I think, the basic idea of this. Yeah, I think the questions ran out. But thank you very much for the questions. It also was very nice that you gave me 15 minutes extra to talk on. So thank you. And please come with me if you have any questions about this.